It's really an honor to be here and really focus on something that I think is really tremendously important, which is this, how do we design a future that actually works in a world that is accelerating in every possible way, accelerating in terms of change, accelerating in terms of a range of evolutionary forces. So to introduce you to the basic idea of the book and what I'm trying to get across in the book, and the basic idea of what we've been building here at Arizona State University with our 140,000 students and all the other things that we've got going on, is you have to understand that there's two strange evolutionary forces that will greatly impact whether or not we can actually design a future that successfully works by drawing in all of our learning enterprises and discovery enterprises around the country. And this is the fact that in normal social and cultural evolution, what we're seeing now is several factors. One, accelerated speed of change, which I think has high potential for us to make even greater achievements in terms of our social aspirations. We've got unbelievable technological forces that are likely to be very disruptive at the cultural level. And these are also likely to be net positive in the long run, but very, very disruptive if they're not opportunistically moved in the right direction. We've got significant forces of globalization, of which COVID is an example of a force of globalization, global complexity, global engagement, and so forth and so on. We have increased complexity at every level. That is, life is not what it was one generation ago, 2 generations ago. It's not even comparable to 5 generations ago, and it's as if we're a different species if you look back more generations than 5. And then we have this wonderful, complicating aspect of evolution, and that is unbelievable diversification across all things, blending of cultures, linking of cultures, blending of perspectives, and so forth. All of these evolutionary forces are driving changes in everything, except not that many changes in higher education and learning, or at least not at the same rate of speed, not in the same way. So one of the things that I talk about in the Fifth Wave book are the waves of evolutionary change in the emergence of teaching and learning institutions in the United States since the founding of, even before the founding of our republic. That is, these unique American institutions that emerged, a set of colonial colleges that emerged in the 17th century and 18th century. And then they kept evolving and still evolve today. A set of state colleges that ultimately then, state colleges and universities that then ultimately became community colleges and teachers colleges and all kinds of things, and are continuing to evolve today. And then the uniquely American emergence of the land-grant colleges and universities during the Civil War and afterwards, which then became a powerful force for American change, particularly in the notion of the future of the country and work and so forth and so on. And then this unbelievable American institution that emerged in the late 19th and early 20th century, the American Research University, prototyped at Stanford and Johns Hopkins and the University of Chicago. And so what we have in the United States relative to teaching and learning and relative to higher education is an evolutionary anomaly. Unlike other elements of our society where you have evolution and change and then new, here we have evolution occurring in 2 dimensions. One dimension is new types of learning institutions that are evolving, all the way from the small 4-year liberal arts college all the way to the massive research university like the University of Michigan or something like this. So you have dimensionality in terms of new kinds of institutions emerging, and then within each of those institutional lines, you have evolution occurring within them. That is, they don't go away. That then has created a strange occurrence, which is a rigidity in a disconnect between the speed of social evolution, cultural evolution, and economic evolution, and a disconnect in many of our institutions of higher education, which have found themselves, because of their evolutionary forces, increasingly less and less democratic, increasingly elitist, increasingly driven by exclusion, increasingly unable to scale, unable to embrace technology. Not all institutions, far from it, but not at the same rate of change going on in society. So we have this disconnect. The universities, by the way, are help fueling these changes in society by the things that they're doing, but they themselves are not evolving in a way where they necessarily can be to an increasing extent what is needed in society in terms of designing the future that works, as is the purpose of this discussion. And so, as is the case in American higher education evolution, the fifth wave then is an articulation of an intellectual argument and a practical argument for the emergence of a new kind of institution, one that Arizona State University has been prototyping for almost 20 years, and several others have been evolving in their own way. But this notion of what we call the fifth wave is the notion of can you add a new or an additional form of American higher education, institutions that would be highly egalitarian, highly driven by discovery and research-oriented methodologies, but not methodologies that are not tied intimately to ultimately the broader success of the society itself. And so in a fifth wave, what we're calling a fifth wave university, the universities are built around the notion of egalitarian success at social scale, democratic success at social scale. They're built around the notion of agility, speed, change, adaptability, and then ultimately in all of that, they form not a replacement model for the other four waves of higher education institutions that have preceded them in the United States and have been nurtured and evolving in the United States, but institutions that then become augmentative too. That is, they become an additional element in the profile of institutions. Now, if you think about where we're headed as a society, we've got institutions of higher education in the U.S. laying the foundation for artificial intelligence-based technologies, for autonomous systems, for systems of augmented reality and virtual reality, and all these kinds of technological capabilities are coming out of our universities, and these technological capabilities are going to be unbelievably powerful and unbelievably disruptive to the workforce. The notion then is that education itself is likely also to be even more disrupted than it has been in the last, let's say, 5 decades, meaning then, therefore, that the notion of rigid, fixed, age-bound educational activities or rigid, fixed, in-your-lane only institutions of higher learning may be something that is too incomplete a portfolio of institutions to be able to help the universities to be as contributory in a positive way to our society as is needed. Let me tell you what I mean by this. It turns out that as universities have become more and more elitist, what we've seen is dramatic, negative, inequitable outcomes within our society. It was the case in 1970 that only about 7% of people from families in the lower quartile of family incomes were ever able to achieve a college degree, and 50 years later, it's 8% on a society that's much larger than it was. It is the case that more than half the people that have ever started college in the United States have no degree. They never finished. Half the people that have received Pell Grants, hundreds of billions of dollars of Pell Grants, have netted in no degree, no outcome, because the system, the four waves that have preceded, have become increasingly basically driven by this notion of exclusion. They've become driven by this notion of narrowing for the most part, and those that haven't been have been less successful. That is, they have been seen as somehow a lesser kind of institution. And so one of the things that I've been trying to argue philosophically in the book and practically in the institutional design that we've implemented at ASU is the need for the broadening of the notion of education. We've recently launched a series of reconceptualizations of this institution, even after modifying everything. I mean, we've changed everything within the institution. Our student body is now completely representative of the socioeconomic diversity of the country. We've taken engineering, for instance, from 6,000 on-campus students, largely white and Asian and male, and built an engineering school 10 years later that has 17,000 engineering students on campus, heavily diversified, ethnically, culturally, from a gender perspective, and from a family income perspective, and then grown additionally new ways to expand egalitarian access to research grade engineering, just as an example. So the notion here is that as things move forward, a new type of university needs to emerge in the United States, one that looks at universal learning across the entirety of the lifetime of an individual, one that works in new ways with technology to be able to scale and adjust and adapt to all of the complexities that we're facing in terms of social changes and the other evolutionary changes that I talked about. And so the intent here is to really lay down the intellectual foundation, the practical foundation for the implementation of democratic scale, technologically empowered, high-speed, adjustive, lifetime educational enterprises, but ones that do not abandon the core of what universities are really all about. That is the notion of a faculty that is grounded and rooted in discovery and free and open discourse and knowledge creation and knowledge synthesis and knowledge storage and so forth. And so it is, in fact, coming up on the 12-minute limit here, a proposal launched with a couple of prototypes, Arizona State University and Purdue University, and its new manifestations being probably the two best examples of a new kind of American university, scaled, lifelong oriented, democratically oriented, egalitarian oriented, and technology empowered. And so, Amy, why don't we go with 11 minutes and 32 seconds as my introduction and see where we are in terms of comments or questions. Thank you.
Terrific. All right. Thank you so much. That was a really energizing way for me to start my day and start thinking about transformations in higher ed. You just jumped right in and got us all thinking in bigger and bolder ways. Thank you so much, Dr. Crow. We have a handful of questions. One is, we have a participant who's wondering what innovative practices ASU has in place to retain students, especially first-generation students, those at risk of not completing a degree, things like nudging technologies, for example, because you talk about like the dramatic negative inequitable outcomes and the 50% non-completers historically in higher ed. How are you turning that around?
So that's a fantastic question. It really goes to the heart of many things that we've been able to do. We've been able to double our 4-year graduation rate. We've been able to greatly improve our freshman retention rate. Freshman retention rates are artificially high at schools that admit only A students from high school, or A+ students in the case of many colleges. And so they have ultra high retention. Well, if you admit the students that are actually qualified, they're actually ready to go to college from the totality of the population, the retention rates drop down dramatically and the graduation rates tank immediately. So we've taken literally thousands of steps, technological steps, cultural steps. We've built new tools, new devices, new systems. We're holding everyone accountable for retention and graduation rates. And so at the root of our innovations is this notion of embracing technology and using technology as a tool related to helping us in advising. We have chatbots and no-bots and game-based simulations to help people to stay on track. We've built 150 new degrees, expanding the learning pathway opportunities for students to be engaged. We have eliminated, to the extent that we can, the financial barriers for students to be able to be in attendance. We have 42,000 Pell-eligible undergraduates and 30,000 first-generation students who are in our undergraduate on-campus student body. And in addition, we have online students beyond that. And so what we found is that what one has to create are more pathways, more tools, more technologies, and more commitment to making all of this happen. And for us, it has worked.
That's fascinating. Oh my goodness. I'm so interested in learning more about chatbots and how you're leveraging technology. We had a question around, where are you seeing the greatest advocates for this kind of change and where are you meeting the greatest resistance?
In everyone that's interested in equitable outcomes for the country. So, from different social advocacy groups, from groups interested in fairness and equity. We're seeing huge advocacy from industry who want a workforce representative of the population, who know that there's a shortage of college graduates in the United States. The demand for college graduates is massive. Resistance is multifaceted and at multiple levels. I mean, one area of resistance is other universities that look at an institution like us and say, well, if you're big, you can't be any good.
Hmm.
Isn't it great that you're really taking on these technologies and so forth and so on, but they don't really work? And we're like, well, they don't really work because you haven't tried them and don't know anything about them. And so it is. There's huge resistance to some extent within certain sectors of higher education. You can see this even in the COVID response, where schools felt confused and they didn't know where to go. Not all, but some. And so there's also, it's just kind of interesting. There's this notion that somehow college is a place that must cost $55,000 a year of tuition to go to in a small, quaint, physical location where you're completely immersed with faculty. And that's fantastic. And we have a setup like that. We have setups like that here also within the university, but that can't be the only way that learning occurs. We can't build that many of those kinds of institutions. It's not possible.
You know, we have a couple related questions around culture change. And so one is that institutions of higher education have been historically slow to change and even resistant to change at times. So our participants are curious to learn how ASU and how you have created a culture of change where that change is expected and embraced. And then there's another piece around, like, how did you change the culture of the faculty to evolve with the changes that you've implemented in particular, and how would you advise other institutions' leadership to be that open as well?
So interestingly, so this is part of my point about the four previous waves. So the weird thing about higher education is that evolution can occur within the wave. So in the private sector, all of the previous forms of organization are gone. There's very few corporations that are 400 years old like Harvard, or 1,000 years old like Oxford. Such things don't even exist. But in our sector, they do, and this has to be deeply understood. So there's nothing wrong with Harvard and there's nothing wrong with Oxford at the root. They are a different kind of institution evolving in a different kind of way. So evolution is occurring within each of the waves, and then new waves are evolving. So the reason that the land-grant universities evolved in the United States was that all of the previous colleges were not taking kids from working class families. They were not working on engineering related activities. They were not working on agriculture, two really important things for the country. So the country, in the middle of the Civil War, decided to give away millions of acres of land to each state so that each state could build one of these. Well, likewise, here we are in the early 21st century, and you're not going to go back and necessarily change the culture of the thousands of higher education institutions. You need to build new kinds, new ones. And some of them will come from the old ones and they will evolve, and some will be completely new. So culture change here is really a function of a willingness or a desire to actually take on this expanded mission. Now, culture change is really, really tough. And what we focused on for culture change is we picked several areas to focus on. One, empowering the faculty to be designers rather than bureaucrats, designers of their intellectual future. Second, we focused on increasing the speed of the institution. You make decisions in real time. A third thing that we focused on is the movement away from a faculty-centric culture to a student-centric culture. And that has morphed everything. And by the way, our faculty have bought off on this. They understand this. They understand what this means because they've been empowered as intellectual designers. We also said that we can't do what we're going to do unless we embrace technology. So many institutions of higher education, technology is a side tool, not a foundational tool. In our case, it's a foundational tool because of our desire to scale and to project and to work with people across their lifetimes. And so our idea is to take the core of the university. If you look in this little circle I have here, think of that as everything that we have. 5,000 faculty members, fantastic world-class library, unbelievable assets, unbelievable things. And then around that, we've built, call it 75 to 100,000 students that live around the core. And then what we've decided is if you technologically enhance that, can you project out from that to workers, to people throughout the entirety of their life? Now, not every college and every university knows how to or would want to do that, but some better figure it out. Otherwise, we're going to have this highly disjointed culturally anachronistic set of higher education institutions that are not adaptive to the kinds of things that we're really facing, as I stated at the outset, in terms of the evolutionary forces that are out there. So lastly, on culture change relative to faculty, the key is the empowerment of the faculty as intellectual designers of their own fate. And that's really what we focused on.
That's terrific. We have a couple of questions related to how COVID-19 is impacting what you're doing with ASU. So one is around whether and how COVID-19 is changing or modifying your fifth wave vision and plans for higher ed. And then another is really around COVID-19 impacting the economy, and how is ASU supporting your grads to join an uncertain workforce? Like, what are you doing to bridge from what students are learning in your institution to what they're doing in their next steps in their careers?
Well, COVID-19 is obviously affecting everything. It's a global pandemic. It's affecting all behaviors. It's affecting everything. So for us, 3 months into this, we're already a different institution. When we started, we had two modalities for teaching and learning. We had full immersion on-campus technology enhanced learning, and we had digital immersion online technology enhanced learning. Now we've built something in between, full immersion synchronous technology enhanced learning. What that means is that we can now Zoom anyone in and Zoom anyone out to the live interactivity of the university. In fact, we're spending tens of millions of dollars to make sure that come August, we can do anything, anywhere, with anyone. And that's different than online education. We've also altered our conceptualization of where all the learners are and how we need to connect to them and how we need to work to connect. We probably become more understanding and adaptive of individual circumstances. It used to be, the reason there's 35 million people that didn't finish college was because, a kid got sick for 3 weeks, they dropped out, and then that was it. There was no way to go back. You're off cycle. I mean, it's a terribly rigid system. And so we've learned to now loosen up on that rigidity. To the question of workforce, our graduates are going out. We're building tele internships. We're connecting people with companies. We're zooming people in, zooming people out. We're connecting. But I think more than anything, what we're basically doing is communicating, adapt, adjust, adapt, adjust to all of our graduates. We graduated 17,000 people on May 11th.
Wow.
And most of them are out and advancing and progressing and so forth. But our hope is that they are that we've created what we call master learners, people capable of learning anything, who are also adaptive and compassionate and empathetic and working to adjust to where we need to go relative to COVID.
You've talked a lot about faculty as designers, and I was impressed to hear how you've created 150 new degrees, and you've been thinking a lot about how to be nimble as an institution. And a participant asked if there are similar avenues for students to give feedback on how they'd like to see programming evolve or give feedback into what they appreciate. Can students be part of the design process?
They are a part of the design process. In fact, we have large numbers of student-designed initiatives. We have a student initiative called Luminosity, which has deployed its own 300-plus network of 3D printers printing PPE material, responding to rural hospital needs and Native American community needs and all kinds of other things, all designed by students. And so that we do get lots of feedback. We have a feedback loop for students relative to their design inputs and their design activities. We do have, in a sense, our School of Sustainability emerged because, the society was evolving, I think rightly so, towards a desire of having more and more sustainability outcomes than the universities were doing. And so that was demand driven. And so we also have demands, we want this, we want that. And you don't respond to everything in a literal sense, you respond to everything in a design sense. And so, yes, students have substantial design inputs.
We have a couple of questions around secondary education and what key skills secondary education should be focusing on now to prepare students to be successful in ASU, but also a similar question, what do high school students need to learn and be able to do in order to be able to enter a fifth wave institution?
Well, those are broad questions. So we
Yep.
run 11 charter schools ourselves, K through 12 charter schools. Our objective is that everyone graduates and everyone goes on to post-secondary education. We also run a 22,000 learner digital high school called ASU Prep Digital, and so we've been learning from those things as well as running one of the largest teachers colleges in the country. And so for secondary education, you know, that's a huge vulnerability for the United States because we haven't modernized secondary education to produce this adaptive learner that we really need to produce to go on learning throughout their entire life. And so what we're doing and what we're pushing is how do you create the voracious learner, the learner who is not rigidly being driven down certain kinds of paths, but has found ways to enable and to enact and to empower their inner learner, their inner discoverer, their inner scientist, which all humans have inside them. And so, to the specific question about success at ASU coming out of high school, I mean, really, the way that we look at this is we have built adaptive learning platforms in math, in science, in English, in a range of subjects that help students to figure a path for learning. So what we're really after is we embrace the notion of human beings having multiple types of intelligence: emotional intelligence, spatial intelligence, tactile intelligence, analytical intelligence, verbal intelligence. And so what we're looking for is finding students to find a path to learn, and then being confident enough to come to us and then find that path and perhaps broaden that path. And so a little bit of an obtuse answer. I appreciate that, but success is really empowering this learning process.